Project Librarian at UNC Charlotte. I am on the OPAC committee at NC Live, which is why you are hearing from me first. I'd like to welcome you to Permaculture Pedagogy, a vision for regenerative systems of student learning, OER, and library publishing. The presenter is Kyle Denlinger. Sorry, Kyle, if I did that up.
Yeah,
he's going to introduce himself to you all, but I do want to say I'll be monitoring chat, so put your questions in chat as they come to you, but we won't take any, we won't do questions until the end of Kyle's presentation. All right, with that said, I am going to hand it over to you, Kyle.
All right, thanks so much, Abby. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for choosing to attend my talk. My name is Kyle Denlinger. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm just really excited to be here to talk to you about this. I'm coming to you from Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem, where I'm the digital pedagogy and open education librarian at the Z. Smith Reynolds Library. And again, I'm really excited to talk to you. So we live in a time of conflict and uncertainty, and the world can feel really heavy a lot of the time. It might seem strange in the face of these immense challenges, but I want to really share with you a simple pleasure of mine that has brought me solace amidst all of this chaos. Dirt, well, more precisely, soil. So dirt is just eroded rocks and minerals, but it's mostly devoid of biology. But you get some organic matter and some microbes in that dirt, then you start getting some soil, which is, we've commonly known soil as a symbol of life and renewal. It's where seeds take root and grow into beautiful plants. It's a medium for growth, a cradle for nature's cycles, a testament to the resilience and abundance of life. And in many ways, the soil has become a metaphor for my approach to facilitating digital projects with undergraduate students. And for the next, 35, 40 minutes or so, I'm going to bring every single bit of meaning out of that metaphor that I possibly can. And I apologize in advance if I wind up sounding like this guy. I don't want to focus too much on the problems today, but things are generally depressing enough. But if you were to take a quick snapshot of higher education just by looking at current headlines, you'll get a taste of higher ed's collective anxiety and its resistance to change, its colossal distrust of students, its endless search for ready-made tech solutions, its doubling and even tripling down on oppressive structures intended to preserve education as a commodity. Our institution's priorities are misaligned with our students' learning and well-being. After decades of slavish devotion to a commercial model of education, higher ed has become like modern industrial agriculture, maximizing yields and profits through scale, mechanization, monoculture, efficiency, extraction, exploitation. It achieves this efficiency through industrial solutions to pedagogical problems, exploitation of cheap and abundant faculty labor, grades, which are literally a product of the food industry, which distort student motivation and harm their mental health, massive lecture courses and online programs, expensive commercial textbooks that exacerbate income inequalities and drive food insecurity, learning management systems and homework platforms that grease the gears of surveillance capitalism, academic surveillance technologies like remote proctoring systems and plagiarism detection software that presuppose students as criminals. We've been sending the message to students that the goal of higher education is to earn a degree by any means necessary. It's an exercise in jumping through the right hoops and getting the right grades in order to get a good job. We've been sending them the message that real knowledge is locked behind paywalls, that their own knowledge is immaterial, and in fact, that they cannot be trusted to demonstrate their knowledge outside of a sanitized panopticon in which every mouse click is tracked and every paper is approved by an algorithm. For decades, we've been treating students like so many rows of corn on an industrial farm. As the heavy machinery of academia does all of the planting and harvesting, it compacts the soil below, rendering it less capable of retaining water and making artificial irrigation increasingly necessary. We're intolerant of weeds and pests and other things that might decrease our yields, so we cover our crops in all manner of poisons, killing not only the weeds and the pests, but also the pollinators and the microbes in the soil that make nutrients available to plants. The soil is poisoned, it's dead. So we apply synthetic fertilizers to feed our crops. And now the only crops that can survive in this soil are those which we've specifically engineered to eat poison. But students aren't corn, of course. Students have agency. When they realize that to earn a degree, is to endure a diet of poison, is it any wonder that they seek shortcuts? The goal we've implicitly set for them isn't to learn, but to get a degree as efficiently as possible. Is it not reasonable then that students might turn to buying a paper online or having ChatGPT to write their paper for them? If the message we're implicitly sending to students is that we don't trust them from the jump, is it any wonder that they don't feel obligated to uphold their end of the social contract? Okay, so I know I'm speaking in generalities and with quite a lot of hyperbole, and I promise this won't all be a manifesto. There are certainly institutions that are actively working against the industrial model of education, and there are, of course, faculty and administrators who are committed to cultivating student learning in authentic and meaningful ways. Plenty of faculty have done away with surveillance tech and grades and actively cultivate an environment of trust in their classrooms. Regardless, I think that we can all see how the industrial model of education is broken and how it's playing out in undesirable ways. Real quick, I want to see what you're thinking. Hopefully this works, but let's take a minute to brainstorm some other examples of how the industrial model of ed is playing out. I've got this poll everywhere set up. You could either try something there and go to pollev.com/Kyle Denlinger and see if you have other ideas for how industrial education is playing out, or you could just leave some in the chat. So I'll wait for maybe 1 minute to see what kinds of responses we get. Yeah, the scholarly publishing cycle, academic publishing in general. MBA. I have a lot to say about business schools, but I won't say them here because this is being recorded. Student worker labor issues, yeah, exploitation of student labor. There's something in the chat here. I'm interested what you mean by that. You know, sadly, there has to be some kind of preventative. Feel free to unmute. I don't know if you have permission to, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you. This is such a privilege to learn. Now I am a library assistant, and I helped my husband through divinity school, and I was on the list of friendly editors. You know, I could look over his papers and so on, but there has to be some type of, and I hate to use the word policing, but plagiarism is so easy to do, even in the highest level. And you had talked about the electronic editing, electronic, you know, and there has to be some type of guard. And right now it's just so fickle. I find it very fickle. I'm terrified at the idea of re-enrolling in school because of the plagiarism. You know, it's so easy to do. You had talked about that just now, addressed that.
Yeah, it's
that's what I'm addressing, but I didn't know how to phrase it correctly or politically correct. Thank you so much for the privilege.
Of course, yeah, thank you for those thoughts. Yeah, plagiarism, I think, is kind of a perennial problem, and it always has been. I think it's now just easier than ever. I hope that what follows here is kind of a discussion of different ways of thinking about education as and how we as librarians and library workers can help facilitate that reimagining. But I'm not sure if it's going to tick those boxes for you, so we'll see. All right, so if there's any other responses or if anybody else wants to unmute, feel free. Otherwise, I'll just move on. And thank you for those words, Anita. Okay, I'm going to move on. So now I'm going to transition from manifesto to what I hope is a glimpse of a positive vision of education that does not poison or degrade the soil, but one that is self-sustaining and truly regenerative. I want to share how I see libraries playing a central role in bringing this future to bear, using the principles of permaculture as a guide. I think that by applying these principles to our practice, libraries can help create educational environments that are not only sustainable and equitable, but also more engaging, more meaningful, and more transformative for our students. For the last 5 or so years, I've been really fascinated by the permaculture movement. And for those who are unfamiliar, permaculture is an approach to design and land management that seeks to follow the patterns of nature to build soil, restore environments, and create abundance in the production of food, fuel, and fiber for human use. Permaculture designers and practitioners are often guided by a set of principles that emphasize creating closed-loop systems in the production, storage, consumption, and recycling of food, energy, and materials. These principles can vary widely depending on who you ask, but today I'm going to focus on a few of these principles by David Holmgren, who, along with Bill Mollison, coined the term permaculture in the 1970s and continues to be one of its more prominent thinkers. So I actually have it misquoted here, but this is not Bill Mollison. These are David Holmgren's principles. His principles are as follows. So observe and interact. Take the time to engage with nature to design solutions that suit your specific solution or situation. Catch and store energy. Develop systems that collect resources at peak abundance for use in times of need. Obtain a yield. Ensure that you're getting truly useful output from all of the work that you're doing. Apply self-regulation and accept feedback. So discourage inappropriate activity to ensure that systems can continue to function well. And that we might come back to that in a discussion of plagiarism. Use and value renewable resources and services. Make the best use of nature's abundance to reduce our consumptive behavior and our dependence on non-renewable resources. Produce no waste. By valuing and making use of all the resources that are available to us, nothing goes to waste. Design from patterns to details. So step back, observe patterns in nature and society, and design from these foundational patterns. Integrate rather than segregate. So by putting the right things in the right place, relationships develop between them, and they can start to support one another. Use small and slow solutions. Small and slow systems are easier to maintain than big ones, making better use of local resources and producing more sustainable outcomes. Use and value diversity. Diversity reduces vulnerability to a variety of threats and takes advantage of the unique nature of the environment in which it resides. Use edges and value the marginal. The interface between things is where the most interesting events take place. Creatively use and respond to change. So we should view change as an opportunity, not as a threat. So perhaps you could see some obvious connections to education here, perhaps even obvious connections to libraries. While I don't have nearly enough time to get into all of these, I do want to focus on a few of them and how I've applied them in my own context and how I think we can apply them to our work more collectively. So I'm going to start with observe and interact. Take time to engage with nature, or in this case, our environment in education, to design solutions that suit your specific situation. So Holmgren and Mollison would probably say that this is the most important principle, observe and interact. So permaculture hates waste. This includes wasted labor. If you've ever planted a shade plant in full sun, or tried to grow plants that hate wet feet next to a downspout, you'd know what it means to waste labor and probably money. Permaculture would have you observe your site for an entire year before even moving the first shovel of soil. Which areas get the most sun? Which are protected from wind? Which areas drain well and which tend to flood during storms? Without this knowledge gained through patience and observation, you'll probably wind up wasting effort and time. So when I first started at Wake Forest more than 10 years ago, I was intent on starting some kind of open educational resources initiative like those I'd seen at larger institutions. The benefits of OER were so obvious to me: cost savings, more equitable outcomes, immediate access to course materials, sticking a finger in the eye of commercial publishers, what's not to love? And I waited for years. I wasted years of effort pitching OER to faculty, developing textbook replacement grant programs that never really got off the ground, and generally just wondering if it was a personal failure that none of my OER work was seeming to take root. What I'd failed to do was observe and truly understand my institution and my faculty. Unlike at many other institutions with successful OER programs, at Wake Forest, a private institution where a lot of our students come from a great deal of wealth, Students generally can afford their textbooks, and there's plenty of financial assistance available to those who cannot afford them. There was simply no affordability mandate at Wake Forest, and so administrators had no reason to care about OER, and asking busy faculty to change their textbooks out of the goodness of their hearts just wasn't going to work. I knew the value of open materials beyond just affordability, but a textbook replacement program wasn't going to get very far. One thing that some of our faculty do care about, however, is empowering students to produce work that goes beyond a traditional essay, and I'll come back to this later. So observe and interact. Your specific environment matters. One size does not fit all. Second principle, catch and store energy. Develop systems that collect resources at peak abundance for use in times of need. So this principle I find to be really applicable to this regenerative future of education is the idea of catching and storing pedagogical energies. How can we collect resources and store them for later use? Think of all the water that hits the roof of your home during a typical rainstorm. On most homes, that water goes into the gutter, down the downspouts, and either into the yard or out into the street, ultimately to local streams, rivers, storm sewers. But what if we collected even some of that water to water our gardens later, rather than just letting it wash away? Here in Winston-Salem, a home with a roof of about 1,500 square feet could anticipate collecting over 3,500 gallons of water per month, or 42,000, or just shy of 43,000 gallons of rainwater per year. So you're not only reducing harmful runoff, which harms local watersheds, but you're also saving money. Thinking about that in an education context, what are the pedagogical energies that we can store? Here I'm thinking specifically about work that students produce. So normally when students are assigned a project or a paper, they'll hand it in, the professor will grade it, and then when they hand it back to the student throws it away. Instead of letting that student work be washed into the storm sewer, so to speak, what if we stored it for later use? Even something as simple as keeping a private class repository of previous student projects, with their consent, of course, could be helpful for future students' understanding of the assignment. These materials can be used purely as examples, or they could be used as objects of study or critique. Nothing fancy is required here, just a 3-ring binder or a folder in one's Canvas course. So catching and storing energy, find those things that are going to waste that can be captured and used later on. Obtain a yield. This one's interesting. So ensure that you're getting truly useful output from the work that you're doing. This ties back to this idea of permaculture hates waste. In one of my very first vegetable gardens, I'm an avid gardener, as you might have guessed, but in one of my first ever vegetable gardens, I tried to grow broccoli, in central North Carolina. I planted it way too late in the season, and it grew huge leaves, but it never really flowered. And after months of growing, my broccoli basically yielded a single tiny floret. It was really tasty with some ranch dressing, but given the space that it took up in my garden, it was definitely not worth it. We can apply the same principle in determining what's actually worth it in our classes or those classes that we support. After doing lots of reading on the ungrading movement, it became clear to me that traditional grades were getting in the way of my own students' learning. Grading, a practice I had really hated to begin with, had become even more of a joyless chore. It was all the more discouraging when students would ignore my sometimes extensive feedback and just look at the grade. In talking with other faculty, I sensed that they too felt frustrated by grading. So I started a discussion group on Susan Blum's book, Ungrading, through our teaching center, and about 20 faculty members had a chance to discuss alternatives. Very few felt that grading benefited their teaching in any significant way, and a number of them have since implemented ungrading strategies in their own classes. So by ensuring that we're obtaining a yield, we should be constantly asking ourselves, is it worth it? Is this worth what I think it is? Is this having the intended effect? Are my students benefiting from this? Or is this just a joyless slog done in the name of tradition? Next principle, use and value renewable resources and services. Make the best use of nature's abundance to reduce our consumptive behavior and our dependence on non-renewable resources. So I have not personally done this, but it's an ancient woodland management practice known as coppicing. And this is really a perfect example of this principle. basically encompassing young trees are harvested at a specific time in their growth cycle, which then stimulates the tree to send up fresh growth, little shoots or runners from the remaining stump. This new growth can be left to grow for years and years for later harvest for firewood, or it can be harvested sooner when it is still thin and pliable, and then turned into things like baskets or fences. Done properly and with patience, trees can theoretically be coppiced indefinitely, providing an endless supply of fuel and building material. And for those who've been following open education, the open education movement more closely, you may have heard about the emergence of open pedagogy, which explicitly involves students in the creation of open educational resources. With its roots in David Wiley's notion of renewable assignments, open pedagogy challenges students to make meaningful, valuable, public contributions of creativity or scholarship by producing openly licensed works that live on the open web. It's in open pedagogy that I see a number of these principles coming together. Here are a few examples that I've worked on. I'm going to hopefully share these. Everybody see this website? Maybe an emoji reaction or a yes in the chat. Okay, cool. So I'm just going to share a couple of assignments that I've worked on in the past with faculty here at Wake. This is a project that I worked on and continue to work on with a professor in history whose students do primary source research on gender and sexuality issues throughout world history. This professor came to me in 2009, the fall semester before the pandemic, and just told me he didn't want his students to do a traditional essay. His students were writing all of these essays, and then he would have to grade basically the exact same essays semester after semester. And so he was like, hey, let's try to produce a book. And I said, yeah, let's do it. And so his students have now for a number of years, I don't have everything up in this platform yet. It's kind of, there's a little diaspora of content right now, but I'll show you that students have been taking primary source materials, so advertisements, letters, photographs, pieces of art, and then evaluating or looking at those primary sources through various critical and analytical lenses. And they've been producing really interesting works of scholarship. You know, they're sometimes very plain, very simple, straightforward works of scholarship. But this is getting students engaged in the work of public scholarship. It's getting them engaged in actually doing proper referencing because they know that this work is available to a wider audience. They put a lot of effort into this because they know that other people are going to be reading this, because this professor assigns these as course materials for future sections. And so by the time the students are ready to write their own, they have pretty good familiarity with the previous students' work, and they can refer back to some of these as good examples or less good examples. But they didn't just do traditional essays. This is one that was really interesting. The student was researching a very obscure jazz festival from Kansas City in the 1980s, I believe, 78. And she came to me and asked if we had a recording of this jazz festival. And I said, no, there's no way. But I was able to search around and I found a radio DJ who was working in Kansas City at their local NPR affiliate at the time, who just so happened to have these recordings on some tapes he had at home. And he very kindly uploaded them to the Internet Archive for me. And so we could actually hear the work that the student is referring to. But they also had brochures and handouts and flyers and that kind of stuff. And then let me see if there's another one. And then some of these students were inspired to produce zines, which I did not teach them how to do this. They took it upon themselves to research how to produce a zine, and some of their work is just incredible. And this was the kind of stuff that I would have loved to do as a student. And this is one of those things, going back to this idea of plagiarism, where they could have probably plagiarized some of this stuff, but the attention to detail, the level of creativity and artistry here, I don't think that the incentive to plagiarize is here, right? And this student didn't just stop at creating a zine. They also knew that their material would be inaccessible to people with vision impairments. And so they created an accessible version of this PDF, which is essentially a page-by-page description of all the text and images on the page. It's both available in PDF and a Microsoft Word document. So this student put a ton of effort into what used to be just a standard essay because they knew that future students were going to be reviewing it, and they just wanted to, to impress future students and other potential researchers. Another one that I've been working on, and this one is also ongoing, and it's also with a professor of history at Wake Forest. This professor, her research is in 17th century foodways in medieval Europe. And so she researches a lot of manuscript recipe books. And she had her students do, let me see if I can find this. Before she came to me with this project, she had her students put together a Google site, which is great. And this actually got picked up by the Smithsonian magazine and written up in there. But the students would basically transcribe some recipes from manuscript recipe books that they had access to, and they would do recreations of these. So like a modern day recreation of a 17th century recipe. But as you can see from here, from just looking around here, the site is inconsistent. It's, not very good from a design standpoint. And we were able to take her site, her previous students' work, and integrate that with current students' work and have them actually transcribe recipes on a crowdsourced transcription platform, which I'll go to in a second. So this was the manuscript recipe book they transcribed this most recent semester. And it would have been, let's see. Here's an example. The students, this is of course, the manuscript, and then their transcription of it down below here. But we worked on a platform called From the Page, which is it's free to anyone to use. You can go there and transcribe any documents that are loaded already. But this particular platform, we uploaded this manuscript recipe book. And let me see if I can find a page for you. And it's essentially similar to, let me sign in, sorry. It's very similar to Wikipedia in that anyone can sign in and edit. Depending on the controls you have on a project, you can accept all edits or have them all in need of review before they go public. But the students learned transcription. They learned some basics of paleography. They learned some markup on how to actually make the text appear as it needs to when it's published. So things like headers, how to expand and contract text that I don't know everything about it, but they did a lot of work learning how to transcribe this. And now these transcriptions can go back to the hosting library, which in this case is the Welcome Collection, which makes this material accessible to other readers, to other researchers. And we hope at some point to start taking these transcriptions and indexing them. So categorizing things by the type of recipe, whether it's medicine or food or dessert, or maybe indexing by ingredients. So anything having chicken or feathers, I don't know, can be browsable in that way. So those are just two examples that I have to show you. And I think that might be about all I've got right now, because I'd like to save some time for discussion, but I'm going to stop on this slide here. And I'd like to ask you what you think a regenerative model of education would look like. So not just a model that's sustainable, but one that actually feeds back into itself, that nourishes itself and improves itself over time. So I'll pause here for a moment and let you do that. And again, feel free to just unmute or type in the chat or go to Poll Everywhere if you prefer to stay anonymous. Yeah, textbooks created with student input in collaboration with students, student-led syllabus creation, creative digital project options for assignments, public writing posting, even if anonymous. That's great. And I might want to come back to that even if anonymous idea. It needs to show respect and care for students as people. That's wonderful. And maybe this is where I'll include that point. So this person writes public writing and posting, even if anonymous. And I want to connect that idea to showing respect and care for students as people. So often we require students to do things that might actually put them in active harm, in the way of active harm. So imagine if a student is the victim of stalking or is transgender and is not out to their community or to their family yet, but we require that they use their name on their public assignments and not give them the option to do that. A, that's a FERPA violation. We're not allowed to do that. But B, we're telling students that you have no agency in that decision. You know, you must participate publicly and you have no other options. Whereas if we were to back up a little bit and think, okay, what are some of the consequences that might come of having students participate publicly and without giving them any kind of option to either publish anonymously or do some kind of alternative assignment altogether. I think there's some big risks there. Using a repository, assignments that change over time based on student input. Yeah, there's a really interesting project called DS-106. I'm not really going to share it because it's hard to find and hard to explain, but it's basically an assignment repository that is created by students in the digital design class. They're just kind of small challenges to make a jingle or an image, like a photoshopped image. And it's run on a WordPress site. And this is massive assignment repository now. And anyone who's taking that class can choose any number of these and just kind of demonstrate completing that. If you've ever seen Instructables, this website where you can post, tutorials on how you built a thing. At the end of an Instructable, there's like versions of people who made that Instructable and they could share how their experience went or what they did differently. It's kind of the same idea. Let's see, emphasizing process over product. Absolutely. When we do publish student work publicly, it might feel like we're really emphasizing product, but there's so much work that goes into getting something publication ready. And that's all process, right? So, and at some point, the students become really invested in having that product look and feel the way they want it to, not the way I want it to, or the professor wants it to. So the primary source book that I showed you in previous iterations of that, students spent a lot of effort figuring out how their chapters went together. They would write section intros, section titles, they wrote the preface and all of that stuff. So none of that was really required of the assignment. It's just things that they knew would make a better product. And so they went for it. Shared or collaborative lesson plans and assignments among instructors. It can be iterated and improved upon each semester. Yeah, we do so much work in silos. I know not everyone here teaches, but even in our professional work, we do so much in our own little silos. And if we were to just share our resources with our colleagues, we might find that other people have a more efficient or a better, more effective way of doing things. Yeah, open documentation. That's a whole other conversation. Thanks, Matt. All right, this is great. I'd now just kind of like to, unless anybody has anything else there, I would like to kind of open it up to some conversation. I don't have all the answers. I probably did sound like that crazy conspiracy guy, but I'd love to hear what your thoughts are and where you think we can go from here.
Feel free to unmute yourself if you can. If you can't, I can unmute everyone, and then you'd all have to mute yourself unless you want to speak. So let me know if you have trouble unmuting yourself.
Yeah, or if you just want to ask a question. Okay, so Travis asks, what do you see as the role for librarians in this, especially in institutions where we don't teach credit-bearing classes? Yeah, so I maybe left a little bit of context out there. Thank you, Travis. At Wake Forest, we do teach credit-bearing courses as librarians, but those examples that I was showing you were collaborations that I did with other professors. It happens that I'm in the unit of our library that does digital humanities, digital scholarship work. And so I'm always interfacing with faculty. And from that perspective, so my work specifically focuses on doing these digital projects with students, but I don't think that that's necessarily solely the domain of your digital scholarship people or the folks who might focus on that. So even something as simple as integrating a little bit of Creative Commons license instruction when you do a one-shot, like showing them how to find openly licensed works. You know, the Flickr Commons, I don't know if you remember that, but Flickr is an amazing resource. And they're starting to revamp their, what they call the Flickr Commons. There's now the Flickr Foundation, which is kind of putting a 100-year view on Flickr. Like how do we preserve Flickr for the next 100 years or even 1,000 years? I can't remember. But you know, showing them that, like showing them that there's resources out there that are free to use, that are free to be built upon. So you don't have to give them a full tutorial on, you know, fair use or public domain or anything like that, but say, hey, you know, go beyond Google Images. Like there's all kinds of stuff there, but here's some stuff that you could be sure you could reuse without any risk whatsoever. And there's just really interesting stuff there, you know. Yeah, Matt says especially useful to have resources that'll go with them after graduation. You know, you could show them art store in an art class, but they're going to lose access to that. And Dana, hi Dana, potentially as collaborators between instructors, library staff tend to work across disciplines. We think we're well placed to share resources. Absolutely. I'd love to hear others maybe expand on that, or where anybody else thinks librarians fit into this. I will say one other thing, going back to our principles here, maybe that'll help frame this a little bit. So catching and storing energy, producing no waste. Let's see. Oh, this is, I wanted to include this, but I wasn't sure I'd have time. So using edges and valuing the marginal. So those places where, you know, maybe a forest edge meets a grassland or something like that. That's where there's a lot of really rich diversity and really interesting things start to happen. Think about where classes might butt up against each other. Say we've got an art class and a writing class that are focusing on a similar theme or a concept. Like how can we get those classes in conversation with each other? Maybe in just like one of our one-shots, you could reach out to the art librarian if you're the writing person and say, hey, I've got this writing one-shot. Do you want to invite your art class to have kind of a joint session where we can kind of collaborate in there? But this brings to mind something that came up, I want to say at kind of the height of COVID. Someone in our disability services office approached me. She handles like alternative text formats for students with disabilities. And normally that means, you know, finding an ebook from ProQuest that could be downloaded when, you know, we only have the print or something like that. But this particular student came to them with a request. They had a temporary print and screen disability. I gather they may have had a concussion or something and couldn't stare at a screen or even like look at a page for a while. And our disability services person came to me to ask if I could help them find an accessible version of a graphic novel. And I had no idea what to do. So like, what would an accessible version of a graphic novel be? And I don't think that such a thing exists really. You know, there's no audio book of a graphic novel. That doesn't make any sense. But what would it look like if such a thing did exist? I'm not going to wait for the publisher to do that, but what if we connected various courses in such a way that students wound up producing that accessible version of the graphic novel? So think about the students in that writing class or the reading class, the literature class that are reading that graphic novel, and discussing its themes and content. They might hand that off to a writing class that can start to storyboard or do some basically teleplay writing where you get some space for sound effects, and then that gets handed off to like an audio production class or something like that, or a digital design or digital engineering class, and they do some recording and voice acting. And I see a sequence of courses in which that would result basically in what would effectively be like a radio drama of this graphic novel. And again, like all copyright stuff aside, there's all kinds of complicated issues there, but how rich of an experience would that be if you knew that you were going to inherit a project that 4 classes have worked on before, and the stuff that you're getting is going to be put into use by people with disabilities to solve an actual need. The level of coordination to make that thing happen would be just immense. And it's probably not feasible, but I think that would be an amazing project to work on if we had permission to do it. So that's like that edge case, those edges that might brush up against each other and make some really interesting possibilities. Okay, well, I don't want to hold anybody in silence, but I'd love to hear any final thoughts. I think that's about all I've got for you. I thank you so much for coming. And I'll be happy to stick around if anybody wants to ask questions in a smaller venue, but otherwise, thank you so much for attending. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and yeah, be good. Take care, everyone.
Thanks everyone for coming. I'm gonna stop recording.
Thanks.